Before we can begin creating our rock formations, we first need to create an object as sort of a painting reference to help us along, something to paint directly onto. And what I want to do is create a standard terrain. And what we can do is double click on that terrain to open up the terrain editor. I'm going to increase the pixel size from 256 to 512 by 512. Select our mountain preset. We can go ahead and add a peak in, do mountain once again a couple of times, throw in a canyon, type preset, add that mountain on top of it, and now we've got some pretty nice bumpy variations. And we don't really need to worry about the quality of the way this looks because we're only using it to paint onto. If we go to our gizmo, I'm going to select our size gizmo in the lower right. And I'm using the global coordinate system, which will be more than sufficient. And now what we want to do is get started painting, but first we need to adjust our camera a little so we'll be able to get a nice preview of our rock showing up, or any object you really want to use for this. We're going to select our terrain. I'm going to rename it. And we're just going to call it paint ref for paint reference. I'm going to right mouse click and go to hide from render. We could also select the icon that we can see showing up as a ghost, and that will also hide it from the render. Now what we can do is go up to our ecosystem painter, and what I've already done is loaded in the objects I want to use for this, which is 4 different rock objects. Each were created with the standard rock object within view, and then I baked them to polygons and added my own material. And the reason I baked them to polygons was to remove any sort of color variation from them, and it also gives me a little more flexibility with the material when you do that, so that way you don't have some random colors showing up and you can really control the overall surface. Now the material on each one of these rocks is set up with the global coordinate system, so these objects we're going to be creating at first, the material might not look right, but what we'll do is adjust these objects afterwards and scale them down in order to match our global coordinate system. I just need to change some of our settings. I want to turn off restrict to selected objects, because if I do go off onto the ground plane, I do want that ability. If you do want to select to only paint just on that terrain, you can go ahead, make sure that terrain is selected, and restrict to selected objects is turned on. I'm going to turn on the airbrush style, which will help us change the size of our rocks. I'm going to increase our brush flow a little. Go ahead and change that to 40, and our radius I'll set to 20. Scale set to 1 should be good as a nice little starting point, and I'm going to change our limit density to 60. We also want to take a look at the bottom where we have a bit of everything selected, which is going to paint all of our objects and not just the selected items, which we can do by selecting only selected item and then selecting which item we'd like to paint with. So go to a bit of everything, and now we can start to paint on our terrain. Now it looks like our scale is maybe a little bit too small, so I'm going to go ahead and undo, select our reference object, and scale it down, and we'll just zoom into our views, move in our camera, because I don't want to have to make too many scale adjustments outside of the initial shape of the object. We'll go back in and paint, and now we can see those rocks showing up. And if we click on our main camera preview, we'll start to see those being rendered and showing up in our scene, but not the terrain. So now that we have this terrain, what we're painting onto, we can use this to build onto our formation. So I'm going to move this terrain up, and now we can paint with that position. And I'm going to move our ecosystem painter over to the side so we can see all of our different views, because we will need to adjust the overall position of our terrain. And since the top view is locked to our painter, and we are unable to modify the object within that top view, we're only able to paint. It's much easier this way just to move it off to the side and have access to everything, and that way you don't need to close out that painter and keep opening it, turning it off. It makes it a little bit easier. So now we can paint some objects off to the side and just start building up our terrain, moving it upward to create our rock formation. Go ahead and bring this terrain down to the bottom to fill in some of those areas, because it does need to have a base, otherwise these rocks will not be resting on anything. Now, because I have the airbrush mode on, the longer I hold the brush in place, the larger the objects are going to become. Now, because we also have objects above the terrain where we're at right now, it's going to scale up those objects as well. So if you need to start from the bottom and work your way up, that can be a little bit easier, because that way you don't have any interference with your other objects. But all we need to do is just move this terrain around. We'll go ahead and make this a little more interesting. Bring that off to the side. We want to fill in that gap we can see. And we'll go to our camera options. Just kind of zoom out a little so we can see our rocks a little better. And it looks like we will need to move our terrain and fill in some of these spaces. And we'll go ahead and move that onto the side and the bottom. We can paint over there, paint on this side, and just create a really interesting looking object that you normally wouldn't be able to do just with the standard ecosystem. And rather than sitting there and individually placing each individual rock, this way you can shape it out using any object. Really, it doesn't have to be a terrain. We could also use any of the primitives. But I think I'm going to stick with that. And what we have right now as a good starting point, and we're going to make a few modifications to this, because at the moment these rocks aren't very interesting. They're all kind of around the same size. Once again, too, we have that material where it's not very interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and do a render so we can take a look at the object and see really what needs to be changed. So we'll go to our render options. Just going to set this to the final mode, render it to the screen, and we'll just do an 800 by 600 render, which should go pretty quick. And what we can see is that a lot of our rocks aren't touching the formation. They're kind of floating in place. So what we could either do is paint in some more rocks to fill in the area, or increase the size of the rocks in the parts of this formation where the rocks aren't touching. We can also see in our material if we take a closer look that really doesn't match up to the scale of these rocks. The bump map doesn't really look right. So I am going to be scaling down all of these rocks altogether. But first, we're going to make a couple more modifications using the ecosystem selector to change around this formation. And depending if your system can handle it, you could also choose to display all of these rocks as the actual geometry, and that way you have a little better idea of the overall shading without having to do a render. So I am going to turn on that preview. We're going to go to the display options of the Ecosystem Painter, and I'm going to change our default quality to smooth shaded. And then we can close out our Ecosystem Painter. And now we'll be able to see all of those rocks in the full quality within the preview. And we don't have to worry about looking at those billboards. And really this ended up only being 433,000 polygons, so that's not bad at all. Basically any system should be able to handle that. So now we're going to go back into our 4 views so we can see the rock formation from the top. We're going to open up the Ecosystem Selector, and first I'm going to select all of our objects. And now what we can do is convert these objects to other types of objects, but what I'm going to be mainly doing is manipulating these instances. So we're going to select the Manipulate option, and now we can use the gizmos that we would use to manipulate any sort of other object that we have within view directly on these painted ecosystem. So I'm going to switch this to our scale gizmo, and I'm first going to stretch this upward, and that's going to make our rocks a little less squished, sort of the way they were before. What we can also do is adjust the rotation. Now, unfortunately, the local mode for rotation will not rotate each individual instance. You will have to go in and select individual groups for that. Even with parent mode, it's all going to be pretty much the same sort of rotation. So we're going to go back to our selector, and I'm going to select none. And now we can grab kind of randomly, and now we have 228, so around half of the total amount. Change that to the Manipulate mode, and we can just rotate our object in the side view, and then we'll move up to the top view and we can rotate that as well. We could use the main camera view just to give us a little more variation with what we already have. I'm going to select none, select a few more objects, and now we have 136. Change that to Manipulate. And what I just had to do was turn on Deselect and then go to Manipulate, because when I selected Manipulate, Select was still ticked off. So when we go ahead and change to Deselect and then Manipulate, it will refresh correctly. And that seems to be more of a little bit of a bug than anything else. So now we'll just adjust the scale. We can go ahead and move these off to the side. Keeping in mind that our rotate around object will not work with ecosystem instances. So if we go to move around our object using the gizmo for the camera, it's really not going to give us any sort of advantage. So now we have a little bit of overall scaling and some modification made to our formation, and I'm going to open back up the Ecosystem Painter. And now what I want to do is change this to color and scaling. I'm going to turn off coloring, and what I want to do is adjust our scale. We can choose to drive this with pressure if you're using a tablet. Right now I'm just going to use the mouse, and we're going to increase the scaling So now as we move over these objects, we will be increasing their scale. And this will allow us to fill in some of those areas where we have floating rocks. So we want to find those areas and just go over them with the brush to increase the scale. Now it can be a little difficult only being able to paint in the top view to fill this in because we can't go at it from the sides. As we can see right here, we have a few objects. We just need to take a look in all the different viewports to kind of figure out where we need to fill in, and if needed, paint in some new objects in order to fill in those sections. But I'm mainly just looking to make sure that everything is filled in and we don't have any floating rocks. We of course could have floating rocks, really depending on what you want to do with the scene. Of course that's entirely up to you, and you could be extremely creative about it and do some pretty neat looking types of objects along with other objects than just what I have, just some plain rocks. But we do want some extension to make it a little more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the ecosystem painter. We can close that out. And now I'm going to do another render, and we can take a look at the rock formation with the changes. And we can see, of course, that material is still a little bit too small for these objects. But overall, we have most of those gaps filled in. We can see in our shadow, if we take a look to our left, we can see one rock being extended a little. I'm going to go ahead and leave that because it is still connected. And that's our main goal, is just to make sure everything is connected. And now what I want to do is scale this down to match our terrain and the overall size of that. Basically, if we take a look at the terrain, which is showing up underneath the ground plane and really shouldn't be, we want to scale it around to that size. It'll give us a good reference and starting point. So we'll go back to our ecosystem selector, and we're going to select all, choose manipulate. We can move that panel off to the side, select our gizmo, change it to the move or the scale gizmo, and now I want to scale this down, and we are going to move it a little closer to the ground plane, and we can take a look at our material and the overall scale in relation to the object. I could also go back to these individual objects, open them up, change that material to an object-based material, and that way we wouldn't have to adjust the size. But if you're working with a scene that is in real-world scale, it'll be a lot easier to use the object material mode, or sorry, the world material mode and that coordinate system. Also because we are adjusting the sizes of our objects, making them a lot larger than the original shape and the original size of the rock. So if we had sort of a fixed material on that rock, it wouldn't look right when we rendered it out, and I think there would be too much variation. So we'll just go ahead and move that down, and we want to get it intersecting with our ground plane. And we can see that we have another floating rock just off to the side, so we can modify that if needed. We'll go ahead and select our 4 viewports, and I'm going to select none for our ecosystem selector. And we're going to try to find out exactly where that rock is at. If we take a look at the camera, we can see where it's pointing, and we should be able to select it. And we can see it's more towards the front. So we just select that area, all of those rocks, change this to manipulate, and I'm just going to move that in and scale it up. And I've selected several different rocks, but that's okay. And now we've connected that. We can squish that, make it a little larger, really do what we want with it to get it to the shape we need. Okay, so let's close out our ecosystem selector, and we're going to take a look at a render with our material. It should be a little bit closer. If not, we can still modify the scale of all of our instances. I am going to adjust our atmosphere a little to improve the quality and the lighting of our scene. So under our light option, I'm going to change and increase more towards sunlight. Our ambient light more towards the sky option. Change this to global illumination. And I'm going to turn down our quality boost because we really don't need a high quality boost for global illumination with this type of a scene. Go to our sun. We can pick it up into the atmosphere a little and move around its rotation in the scene, enough to show the depth of our object. And that should be good around there. I'm going to go to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab and increase our glow intensity, and then decrease our scattering, and that's going to pick up a lot of the light in our ambient and shadowed areas. Maybe turn down our glow. And we're going to start there and render that out and take a look. And it looks like I may have made our object a little too small now. So we might have to go ahead and just increase the size. Go to our ecosystem selector, select all, change that to manipulate. Go to our size gizmo. We're going to scale that up. Not as large as it was before. And I'm also going to squish this down just a little. And let's go ahead and take a look at a render of that. And now that material looks a little bit better. It's now positioned a little more correctly, or scaled along with that world coordinate system a little better. One thing you'll notice is that we have a lot of really large rocks on the bottom. That was mainly caused by using that scaling mode within the ecosystem painter, adjusting the scale overall for your different objects. So another thing you can do if you want to adjust your scale for just a specific area of the object, of course at this point, since we've already created them really large, what we would have to do is rotate around the object so that we could see those different rocks in the top view. But if we take a look in our 4 viewports, we can use our terrain again to sort of cut out where we're going to be adjusting our object. So if I just want to adjust the scale of these instances on top, I can open up the ecosystem painter, and with color and scaling on, coloring off just using scaling, we can go in there and adjust the scale, and it does look like it is going through down to the bottom. So what I would suggest is that you can rotate around the entire object using the ecosystem selector. So you could modify its rotation and adjust those side objects. But you can still use this top, or this terrain that we have in the view to kind of cut through your object and take a look at the different parts while you're painting in this method. And I'm just going to go ahead and move our camera. We're going to take a look from another viewport. Go ahead and zoom out. And I do want to adjust our lighting just a little. Just moving our sun so we can start to see those highlights on our rock. And adjust the glow and scattering that we have. So we'll move our camera in just a little. And now we're going to render this out. And if we take a look at this render, we can see the rocks look pretty good overall. Now, the objects I'm using are kind of a low polygon objects. These rocks are, considering we have around 600 of these different rocks, and we only have a little over 400,000 polygons in the scene, they're really low polygon. So what I could do is increase the polygon level of these rocks in order to make it look a little bit better. But for the most part, I think it looks pretty good. And what we can also do, if we want to add an ecosystem to these rocks or manipulate them individually, is we can convert them to objects. So we're going to take a look at that right now. We're going to open up the ecosystem selector, make sure we have all of them selected. Select manipulate, and then convert to objects. And we can see in our layer view that we have all of those rocks loaded in. So if you want, you can go ahead and select them all and add them into a group. In order to condense all of that. But now we can go through, we can see some of these areas that aren't connected. You can select these objects and move them in order to connect over. And when we're done too, we can move them back to the ecosystem. So this way we can manipulate individually without using the painter, if that's what you're looking for. We'll just move those in. We can see some of these sections might need to be changed. We just scale those up, move them in. And what I want to do is take this rock and scale it out, move it down in order to fit correctly and look like it's propping up that section. Go ahead and take these objects, switch to our local mode, and scale them. So now we can scale them individually where they still are in the same position. We don't need to worry about moving around their pivot points. And we'll stretch that out and move it into the side, just to catch some of those rocks that may be free floating still. And it looks like we got pretty much all of them. And I'm going to take this one over here on the end and move that in. And I do want to prop up these sections on the side, so we'll just scale it up, We can rotate it. This really large rock we have on the bottom, I'm going to move in so we can see some of the smaller ones. We could also go in and delete some of these as well. Now I do have our red wireframe turned off. If we go to the File Options, we can see Show Red Wireframe on Selected Objects, and also highlight parts using current material. I have both of those turned off, which is why you're not seeing the rock selected. I notice that sometimes you will get a little bit of a better response in the OpenGL if those options are turned off. So although you cannot see the outline wireframe of the object that you are manipulating or selected with, you will get a little bit of a better response time, especially with procedural terrains, and that's definitely one thing that I've noticed. So that can be helpful to turn that option off. So now we can go in here and select some of these larger rocks that we created and scale them down in order to get back the detail that we need in this formation. And really this is more about tweaking at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and stop before I spend far too much time tweaking these materials and objects. And we'll just go ahead and position our camera. And what I'm going to do is take some of these objects and change their material name and add a little bit of an ecosystem. Also, because these are now objects in the scene, we can paint an ecosystem directly onto these objects. We can also manipulate the rocks and make them a little more higher detail by adding displacement mapping to the material. First, let's go ahead and render out this new view of our object. I'm just adjusting our lighting a little. And now I'm going to go ahead and render that. And if we take a look, we can see now that I've fixed some of those areas, the overall structure looks a little bit better, a little more realistic. What we can also do is go into our post-render options just by clicking next to the save icon. We have our post-render options. You can also right mouse click on the camera and go to Edit Object, which will bring up this window. What we can do is add a few effects to make this look a little cooler. We could add some lens glare, kind of use a smaller radius, increase the amount, and click OK, and it's going to apply that. And now we can see that nice glow around the edges of our rock, since we have a really bright looking scene. So that's a neat little thing you can do with this to make it look a little more realistic, a little bit cooler. And now what I want to do is take our objects and adjust the material and just put out an ecosystem. So instead of painting on this, what I want to do is use a global ecosystem or a material-based ecosystem. And before I add in the ecosystem, the first thing I want to do is just take all of these rocks. We can select our top rock in the layer, hold down Shift, and select our last one. I'm going to right mouse click, group these objects, and then right mouse click again and bake them to polygons. And now our slider isn't going to do anything because all it's doing is taking these different objects and making them into one object. Let's go ahead and click OK. And now we can select this object in whole instead of it being individual rocks, so we can no longer edit it, but it's going to make it a little bit easier to add in an ecosystem and also use this object maybe in other scenes if you wanted to, or do any overall manipulation. So now I'm going to select the material for this rock object, and what we have is terrain number 7 from the terrain pack that's available through our website. I'm going to change this material to an ecosystem. Just going to add in an ecosystem layer. If we go to the last tab, which is the environment tab, I'm going to go ahead and reset these sliders to the default, giving us a full slope range, full altitude, and getting rid of our fuzziness options. In the general tab, we're going to add in a plant. And because the maple tree should render pretty quickly, it's a pretty nice variation, we're going to start with that. We can populate, and we're currently not seeing that show up. So we do want to go to the density tab, make sure we turn off decay near foreign objects, increase our density, and we may need to adjust the scale and turn that down. So let's bring our scale to 0.2, and we'll go ahead and bring it down to 0.1, and then go to our scaling orientation tab and reduce the overall scaling. Because we're not working with this entirely real-world scale, so we do need to size down our trees. We could also increase the size of our object and then the size of the material as well to match if we did want to work in real-world scale. So now we have all of these maples showing up on our rock formation. Making the scene a little more interesting. And just positioning the camera. I'm going to go back to our lighting option. Increase our sunlight just a little, and increase our sky dome lighting gain. Go to our sky fog and haze, and I'm going to increase our glow amount. Actually, we'll go ahead and decrease that, and we'll just decrease our scattering. And we can adjust the aerial perspective to really affect that glow intensity as well. If I bring it up to 50, we'll see a little more overall glow. Bring it up to 500, you'll really notice that overall glow effect. So that's another way to sort of adjust your haze in the scene and lighten everything up. And I'm going to go ahead and stick with that. And we can render this out and take a look. So we can now see the render with that post-process effect on. We can go ahead and turn off the lens glare and take a look at the original render. One thing you can see is that the material has now changed again, and that's because we added an ecosystem layer to the material, which has reset the size we had defined for the overall object. So we may need to adjust scale in order to match that up again. And because we have the ecosystem based on the material, once we scale up this object, our ecosystem is also going to move with it. Now, because we're increasing our scale, we also have that aerial perspective showing up a little more intensely because we're increasing the thickness of our atmosphere. So we're going to go into the atmosphere editor and bring down our aerial perspective down from 150. We'll set it to 50. And we'll see how that looks with this scale. What we could also do is go into the material and adjust the individual scale of each layer. Let's go ahead and render that out and take a look. And now we can see our rock showing up with the ecosystem. Scale might be a little bit too large, really depending. I could increase the scale of our material if needed. For the most part, you can see we have a really interesting looking rock formation. We're able to add an ecosystem to it. You could do this to create rock outcrops coming out of terrains, and really making some more interesting looking scenes than what you can normally do with terrains and some of the standard rocks. Really depending on what you want to do with painting your ecosystem with these types of objects, you can create different types of objects really quickly, and also use the ecosystem painter to do a lot of other different types of effects. So this is one method of using the ecosystem painter to create these cool rock formations, and you can set up and create scenes however you want to make these objects. And I'm going to go ahead and turn on that post process, and we can just take a look with that lens glare on once again. If you want, you can adjust the overall radius of that, and of course incorporating this into a scene, it would look a little bit better. Right now we just kind of have a white background, really with the main focus on the rock. And all of these objects and these scene files are available in the content folder, along with the training, as well as these renders and a couple of other ones, so you can take a look and see what can be done with this type of painting modification. And there's just one last thing I want to add, and that is you could make this even more interesting, more detailed as well, by adding in an ecosystem of the rocks that you use to actually paint the rock structure. So that's another way to add a little more detail to this, using the same objects, and then you have the materials matching, and you can add a lot more detail that way, and you don't have to worry about any gaps. So you can also sort of create your outlining structure, create sort of your base shape, and then use a material ecosystem like we just did with trees, but using rocks instead.